very thing that many of us try to account for and strip away, we would have no material at all, just as we have no data whatsoever of Jesus' next-door neighbor, any of his aunts or uncles, or the synagogue leader in his hometown. Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker is Paul Foster, Memory, Help or Hindrance in Historical Jesus Research. Paul.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. My paper's arranged in 3 sections. First of all, what is historical Jesus research? Then, getting to the nub of the question, I want to ask, what is the contribution or role of memory in historical Jesus research? And unsurprisingly, I will end with a conclusion, or at least that's the plan at this stage. So, what is historical Jesus research? Perhaps the first step in assessing whether memory or memory studies can assist historical Jesus research is to have a clear indication of what historical Jesus research is and what its goals might be. However, let me first be totally upfront with you. I do think memory studies are of value, especially in terms of tracing the transmission and mutation of Jesus' traditions. Memory studies can provide added traction for understanding the forces that shape the forms in which traditions were passed on within texts or community settings. That is what has typically been described as Traditionsgeschichte approach. Social memory theory, therefore, is helpful in that it examines the way that texts or groups redeploy their own formative myths in ways that sustain the ongoing life of the community. That is without doubt valuable work. However, you knew that was coming, didn't you? However, my contention is the following, namely that such research, important as it is not historical Jesus research as it is typically understood. But on that last point, please do not trust me. Here is a survey of some statements concerning the purpose of historical Jesus research from several major scholars spanning the last part of the 20th and early part of the 21st centuries. In what is perhaps one of the best known and pictorially imaginative statements, J.P. Meyer explains historical Jesus research in the following manner, using the fantasy of the unpapal conclave. That might have been written in the days of John Paul II or of Ratzinger. Maybe he'd be happier these days to have the Pope involved, I don't know. He says, suppose that a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, and an agnostic, all honest historians, it's good we have no dishonest historians, isn't it? Cognizant of first century religious movements, were locked in the bowels of Harvard Divinity School, put on a Spartan diet, and not allowed to emerge until they had hammered out a consensus document on who Jesus of Nazareth was and what he intended in his own time and place. The basic requirement that the consensus document be open to verification by any and all persons using the means of modern historical research would produce a narrow focus, a fragmentary vision, perhaps even distortions, end quote. Meyer places great store in the objectivity of the historical method, perhaps too much confidence in historiography, which often requires in itself individual value judgments and subjective perspectives. However, his basic understanding of the goal of historical Jesus research remains fairly standard, even if his belief in the method's ability to produce results that could be replicated by objective inquirers neglects the degree of subjectivity involved in historical judgments. The impossibility of absolute objectivity is recognized by J.D. Crossan, who states that he is not concerned with, I quote, an unobtainable objectivity, but with an obtainable honesty. Yet what is obtainable for Crossan is presented as being demonstrable through the source-critical and historical analysis of gospel traditions. From this viewpoint, the importance of historical plausibility as a datum for historical Jesus research is central. The interplay between determinations concerning sources and the likelihood of traditions originating with Jesus of Nazareth has been widely recognized. Thus, Tyson and Merck state, the closer a source brings us to the historical Jesus, the more important it is. Therefore, it is important to determine the age of the sources, end quote. The historical method, of course, is not without its limitations, and the criticism that it is a minimalistic approach needs to be squarely acknowledged. Thus, as Witherington eloquently states, what is true about historical Jesus and what the historical method can demonstrate are not one and the same. The latter will always at best be a truncated version of the former. More recently, Dale Allison has flagged up the same question in his invaluable study Constructing Jesus. Allison first asks what he considers to be the chief question of historical Jesus research. I quote, "How much history can we show the Gospels to have preserved?" He then glosses this question in a footnote with the following observation: "How much history do the Gospels preserve is a different question with a different answer. My concern is with the less than omniscient historians who must leave many questions unanswered." Hence, Allison recognizes that the central concern of historical Jesus research revolves around those traditions that can be demonstrably linked to the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth with a high degree of probability. Notwithstanding this limitation, which leads to the recognition that the historical Jesus is not identical with the real Jesus, the historical method remains the best method for determining a reasonably secure set of traditions that have a good possibility of originating with Jesus. One must be honest enough to admit that this historical method itself is not some pristine tool that allows unadulterated access to the past, whatever a pure depiction of the past might be. Thus, as Sanders observes, there is, as usual in dealing with historical questions, no opening which does not involve one in a circle of interpretation. That is, historians always depend on the kind of circle that involves moving from evidence to tentative conclusions, then back to evidence with renewed insight, and so on. There are obvious limits in applying the historical method to historical Jesus research. Moreover, understandings of historiography itself have developed greatly since the beginning of the 20th century. Few, if any, would want to claim that there exists some pure version of history that can be accessed by the application of more rigorous and objective methods. It is widely recognized that there is a perspectival dimension in all accounts of past events. Yet this should not necessarily entail a sense of despondency about doing history, nor should it lead to an abandonment of the discipline of historical Jesus research. Despite wise caveats concerning the perspectival nature of history, it is not necessary to fully embrace the entire postmodern agenda with its thoroughgoing relativization of history and truth itself. It is still legitimate to ask what is perhaps the basic historical Jesus question about Jesus' sayings and actions. In an unnuanced form, the question at the heart of historical Jesus research is still, did Jesus do or say some reported tradition? In a more nuanced form, and in a less stark dichotomy, one can ask about the likelihood of a saying or action being attributable to Jesus of Nazareth during his earthly ministry, and the degree to which that action or tradition might have been mutated in the process of transmission and retelling. These are no doubt hard questions to answer. However, While the man from Nazareth remains such an influential force in not only human history, but in the contemporary life of believing communities, it is unsurprising that people wish to assess the level of confidence they can place in transmitted traditions as reflections of the core message of Jesus. As such, I would contend that solid historical Jesus research must remain one of the central questions of New Testament scholarship. Part 2. What is the role of memory in historical Jesus research? One section of a paper I previously published with the very mild title, Memory, Orality and the Fourth Gospel, 3 Dead Ends in Historical Jesus Research, as the first term in the title suggests, made a critique of the application of memory studies to historical Jesus research. In particular, that discussion examined claims concerning the reliability of memory studies as a means of validating traditions concerning Jesus as being historically accurate. Before developing the thesis further and responding to some of the critiques made on blogs, please let me quote part of the admittedly overlong concluding sentence to that section. The article stated, "Where social memory theory may provide insights into the Jesus tradition is by analyzing how such memories were received and by reflecting on their pastoral or pedagogical function that might have worked in early believing communities." In other words, if that statement is not sufficiently clear, let me say it again. I believe there is a value in the application of memory theory for understanding the development and transmission of the Jesus tradition. Moreover, rightly applied, insights from studies on memory may even help scholars to determine why certain collective memories became resilient and retained greater utility in the early believing Jesus communities. As I see it, my discussion was basically the critique of the application of a fairly recent methodology to historical Jesus research. For some, it was seen as more than that. While my good friend Michael Bird neutrally announced the publication of the article on his blog under the heading Paul Foster's Grenade in the Playground of Historical Jesus Studies, others felt far more was at stake. One kindly soul, who had great pastoral concern for my eternal salvation, offered up the following comment on Bird's blog site. He addressed it to Michael Bird as follows: "Your friend, Dr. Paul, needs to meet Jesus, develop a healed and forgiven relationship with him, and then choose something more profitable to do with his mind. I fear that 'Get away from me, I never knew you' is looming large in the good doctor's future." I guess all I can say to that is, amen, brother. All those scholars should keep away from the Bible. Yet, notwithstanding that warning, I will, in peril of eternal damnation, continue to say something concerning what I see to be the limitation, or better still, misapplication, of memory studies to historical Jesus research. In the section of the article dealing with memory, my primary dialogue partner from within the Guild of Biblical Studies was Professor Richard Borkham. Let me say something about that choice. Borkham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, has received lavish praise, critical acclaim, and has been awarded both the Christianity Today Award in Biblical Studies 2007 and the Michael Ramsey Prize 2009. In this volume, Borkham advances the following thesis concerning the reliability of memory as a means of gaining access to the historical life of Jesus of Nazareth. To quote, "The eyewitnesses who remembered the events of the history of Jesus